and welcome to another episode of the Diplomacy, Law and Policy podcast, The Forum. Today we have with us Malin Sundgren, who is an alumna from the Geneva Academy on International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, from which she graduated in 2008. She studied law in Finland and graduated from Helsinki University's Faculty of Law in 2006. She has 15 plus years of work experience, including with the Finnish government, the UN, and the ICRC in the fields of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the rule of law. Malin was most recently protection of the civilian population advisor for the Asia and Pacific region with the ICRC based in Yangon, and previously held various positions with the protection department of the ICRC in Nigeria, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka, where she worked extensively on PCP as well as judicial guarantees in detention. Since December 2020, she is regional legal advisor for the ICRC based in Bangkok. Before joining the ICRC, Malin worked for different UN agencies in Egypt and in Nepal, as well as for the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Finnish Permanent Mission to the UN. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And I hope that we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion on focusing it on women in conflicts. And I most recently read the report that was sent, the gendered impacts of on and on conflict by the ICRC. And I thought it was very, very interesting in the points that it covered. So just to start off, I wanted to ask, so we know that women suffer disproportionately more consequences of war than men and make up a significant proportion of civilians who are severely affected by the war. So IHL acknowledges this, and it includes general and specific protections for women. Could you talk a little bit about these just to get the ball rolling and how effective they are?
Yes, indeed. So you are definitely correct there. So basically, the specific protection, health, and assistance needs of women that are affected by armed conflict is protected under IHL, and IHL then addresses these protection, health, and assistance needs of women specifically. But I think that it's important to note here right at the outset that actually international humanitarian law affords women the same protection as men. So be they combatant civilians or persons who are no longer participating in the hostilities, actually all of the rules that we have in international humanitarian law afford equal protection to men and women without discrimination. So it's important to note that men and women have the same protection under IHL. And then we do have the specific protection for women, like you were saying. And this is, like I said, because we do recognize that there are specific protection and health and assistance needs of women who are affected by armed conflict. So this is actually the rules in IHL. You can find rules on this both for international armed conflict. So that would be in actually all of the Geneva Conventions. You find provisions that specifically protect women. And also for non-international armed conflict, whether we're talking about the Common Article 3 or the additional protocols, these are also interpreted to include the similar protections for women. This is something that you can find more about in the customary law study by the ICRC as an example of sources that we can look at when we're looking at the specific protections for women. And your question, whether these protections are effective or not, I mean, this is of course quite a complex question. Are any of the protections that international law or IHL offers, are they effective in practice? I would say that there are a lot of challenges in really applying IHL to the realities of the field, and this goes for both men and boys and women and girls, and this is something that we are looking at more specifically in this gendered impacts of armed conflict report. We look at how women and girls and also men and boys, how everybody experiences conflict in different ways. And how IHL somehow could be more effectively applied actually to situations on the ground by taking into consideration this type of gender analysis or gender perspective when we apply IHL, as we talk about in this report. But here specifically for women, I think that we have to recognize that there is still existing inequalities that are there. So whether we're talking, this is really all over the world. So not in one specific country, but in every country in the world, women are still experiencing inequality. Even if equality under law is provided by international law, this is still the reality that we have on the ground, and this we can really deduce from any of the data which is available to us. And in particular, in conflict context, this is actually the reality for women is even more harsh and concerning. So therefore, when we talk about how conflict affects different people, I do think that when it comes to women and girls, we still need to take into consideration that we know that this existing inequality means that there is sort of a compounded or an additional impact on women of conflict, of armed conflict and hostilities. So it impacts everybody in different ways, but women and girls are specifically impacted because of this gender inequality, which is already there. So it's something that this report talks about, and it's important for us to look at as humanitarians. I think we have to really consider gendered impacts of conflict, whether we talk about women, men, girls, or boys.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because just drawing from my own experiences, I did work in South Sudan for 1 year in the development field, and they built this really, really nice health center, which was going to give, free healthcare, free nutritional needs to children, and like deal with mothers and, weaning children as well. And none of the women were coming. And then they went out into the field and they were asking them, why aren't you coming? And they were saying, oh, we can't walk that way because the armed groups are prevalent there. And we know that if we go there, we're going to get raped. And it was just then, going to that extra mile and being like, okay, how do we get them safety in the sense that they can actually come and avail these services that they so critically need.
Exactly, that's one of the gendered impacts. Sorry to interrupt you. It's one of the gendered impacts we mentioned in the report, access to justice, access to services problem that we have in situations of conflict. We also have data showing that boys and men actually have, when it comes to sexual violence, which we know happens to everybody, boys and men actually have also a particular issue of accessing services when it comes to those kind of cases. But otherwise, yes, it's more, it's a big issue for women and girls for sure.
And it is interesting because IHL, especially when we're looking at the Geneva Conventions, they were drafted in 1945, and the conversation has moved on so far from then. So we've seen, and so especially in Article 27 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it says women must be especially protected against any attack on their honor. And it goes on to, clarify rape, enforced prostitution, any other form of indecent assault. And so the notion of honor now is quite outdated. And I read a bunch of criticism about this, that women should not be protected due to archaic conceptions of chastity or modesty. But when it comes down to it, I'm like, substantively, the law is there in terms of the protection it offers. So do you think it matters? I mean, for lawyers, it really matters. Words really matter. Right. But do you think that is that valid, or do you think as long as we have those substantive protections there, the wording doesn't matter so much? It would be nice if it wasn't,
I think it really matters very much. And the key here is really to start by acknowledging that, when you look at the drafting history of the Geneva Conventions, I mean, the drafting of the Geneva Conventions at the time was really informed by, a very outdated view, we could say, on gender and on sexuality as well. So, and very much a gendered view, actually, of the role of women and men in armed conflict. So this is something that we openly recognize also in this report, but I think we've been talking about it for some time, thankfully now. And so, starting by acknowledging that this is an issue, and looking at, I mean, when you look at the terminology in the Geneva Conventions, like you said, it is definitely outdated. It talks about women as victims and doesn't really recognize the role of women other roles that women have in armed conflict. So it's important to acknowledge that. And then what's been happening lately, the past years, and what's happening at the moment is that it's actually a very interesting development in the development of IHL and of its interpretation in specific. We have been working very hard actually the past years in starting to update the commentaries to the Geneva Conventions. And if you look at the original commentaries, yes, we have some of that very outdated language in there as well. Now, when it comes to even the definition of sexual violence, for instance, this has finally been updated in the commentary to the first Geneva Convention. So there you will find finally an updated interpretation also of IHL provisions that regarding to sexual violence, or the prohibition of sexual violence in international law, which is very similar to the definition that we have in the Rome Statute of the ICC. So there are some important developments in that commentary. Then I think last year we have published the commentary to the third Geneva Convention, updated commentary. So that's about detention, right? And there is a lot of provisions in IHL that specifically are about women detainees. So these can be women combatants who are detained as prisoners of war or then detained by armed groups, if we talk about internal armed conflict. So there is a lot of provisions on that, and some of the language there also, and some of it was quite outdated. So there, again, the updated commentary, I would really encourage to go and really look at that in detail, because it addresses a lot of these gender aspects and has really updated, it really includes an updated interpretation of IHL in that regard, like regarding the provisions that concern women. In the Geneva Convention 3. And in addition to that, at the moment, there is an ongoing work then on the updating of the commentary to the fourth Geneva Convention. Later, we'll be doing the same with the additional protocols. It's quite a long process. We have peer reviewers, external ones for that. So it's ongoing at the moment. And as you know, the fourth convention is about protection of civilians and on situations of occupation. So it's a very interesting work indeed. And there's going to be a lot of updates again on the interpretation of IHL when it comes to gender. So this is very exciting. And it's linked to the gendered impacts report, because there we also talk about exactly protection of civilians issues, principles of the conduct of hostilities, how we can apply gender lens to that, as well as situations of occupation and women.
And it was really interesting for me reading the report, because I really liked how they looked at the stereotypes allotted to men and to women. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, because I kind of got into gendered notions of IHL through Orly Stern, who was talking about women participating, DPIHing, directly participating in hostilities with armed groups in African conflicts. And she argues that formally equal laws cannot achieve substantively equal results, and that IHL tends to paint women in one of two ways, as victims or as mothers. And she actually highlights the fact that out of 42 provisions that deal with women, more than half refer specifically to protecting them as mothers. So how can we improve IHL to address the vulnerabilities of conflict, going beyond these specific protections? And given how women are increasingly participating in armed conflicts, how do we get away from these stereotypes of passivity and female weakness? And especially when we're looking at how they interact with armed groups, it's just such a fascinating way about, and she really talks about it in the sense that these women go to their watering holes and they collect water, but they're actually going there to spy for the armed groups and to collect information.
Indeed.
So is it time to do away with these seemingly gendered perspectives? And I noticed that the report kind of touches on the fact that we don't want to widen the definition of DPIH, because we don't want then women to be over-targeted, but it kind of at the same time also says, let's do away with all of these, let's move away from that, you know, women, like men aren't just combatants, women aren't just civilians.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely important. So I would, when it comes to the development and interpretation of IHL, it's again through the work on the updated commentaries that we are really doing this work. So that's an important work in itself. But I think that in the ICRC also, I think that this gendered impacts reports is a good example of that, well, we are also getting better at our own gender analysis, but there is really a big effort, and it's not just the ICRC, I think it's overboard, like humanitarian and academic and otherwise, to really try to talk about impacts of conflict, not only on women and children, but also basically on everybody, and then about gendered impacts when it comes to both men and women and boys and men and boys. So we're broadening sort of a little bit the scope of what we're talking about, and also, yes, very importantly, acknowledging that women have a much more complex role. Like it's not as simple as it may have appeared to the drafters of the Geneva Convention, but women these days, of course, they are increasingly they have different combatant functions. They would be participating in hostilities, or they would have other important functions in the military or in armed groups. And that's something that we have to acknowledge. But I think that this is even, not only humanitarians, like I said, but even militaries and governments are increasingly talking about this and somehow acknowledging that women do have those roles as well. So that's really good, and that's important to continue, to highlight this. That's something we want to do. And we're trying to do also with this report. I know this discussion that you're referring to about the direct participation. There's been a lot of discussion on that, indeed, I think, the past years. It's very interesting and it's quite complex. Like on the one hand, we really want to acknowledge this more complex role of women in armed conflict, like I said. But on the other hand, we also don't necessarily want to broaden legal definitions, because we think that might actually lessen the protection that that women or combatants in general have under IHL. But like I said in the beginning, like for us, really, IHL, any rules that you are talking about should provide equal protection to men and women, and not specifically, the one or the other. It's important to like somehow get away from this notion of women being like the innocent civilian. So, but it's complicated, of course. I mean, we talk about it in the report a lot when it comes to the principles of conduct of hostilities. Like we talk about how there is this gender bias, that we know that it's there. And when we talk about militaries, how do they apply IHL in practice? When it comes to the principles of conduct of hostilities, are they aware that gender inequalities are there? Are they aware of any of these issues that we're talking about here? Like, this would be extremely important. So yeah, there are a lot of recommendations in the report in that regard, but we can get back to that. Maybe, yes. I think the key takeaway from the report is really that we think that any rules of IHL, if you apply and interpret IHL with a gender lens somehow, if you acknowledge that there is a gender aspect of this civilian harm which happens in conflict, then we really do think that this can work as to sort of generate better protection, if that makes sense, in practice for both men and women, whether we talk about situations of conduct of hostilities or direct participation or other.
And it's so important to maintain that balance between ensuring that there isn't the erosion of civilian protection and also maintaining the integrity of the IHL regime and the principle of distinction and who can be targeted and who can't be. One of the most interesting things for me in the report was when I looked at the notion of what is a reasonable military commander, and the idea that reasonableness has generally stemmed from a perception that a man would be in that role and he would be deciding X, Y, and Z, and moving on from that. And especially the principle of precaution, in that the effectiveness of the warning should take into account the perspective of the civilian population that is to be affected, but especially women and girls who generally will spend less time outside of the house and also have lower literacy rates, and the digital divide is much greater. So how are you going to give those warnings to tell civilians to clear an area and ensure that women are then a recipient of those warnings? And the whole idea that this links to a reasonable military commander and what that means, and encouraging more women in decision-making roles, is something very interesting to me, because as a minority women, we've kind of seen that you get tokenistic representation, but it doesn't actually lead to effective, meaningful change for women on the ground. It's the whole idea that, okay, we're talking about ceilings, but we should be looking at the basements and looking at what's happening to women in there. So do you think that there is a way to ensure that this goes beyond tokenistic representation?
Yeah, I think we're really at the beginning of this discussion, so it will require a lot more than this report, you know, for the recommendations that we have in there to become reality. But yeah, I think it's extremely important. We always talk about this at the ICRC when we're also training military and police, for example, or to any audience, that we would be talking about the principles of IHL and the conduct of hostilities. We're talking about the cardinal principle of distinction, right, between military and civilian. Then we talk about the principle of proportionality, where the military commander has to weigh basically between the civilian harm that can be foreseen of an attack and the military advantage that can be foreseen. And what can be foreseen actually in that sense is what a sort of a commander could reasonably be expected to know at the time when he is planning or executing an attack. And it's the same with the precautions. They are also supposed to take then all these precautionary measures in that moment when they are planning or when they are executing the attack as well, because circumstances can change, right, when you are in the conduct of hostilities, between the planning and the execution. But yeah, all of this, like, you know, what does it mean in practice for women and men and boys and girls? You know, like I said, everybody is differently impacted, and this military commander, like, what is the level of awareness that he has in that moment? What can be reasonably expected? Like, so we really encourage in this report, and in our dialogue, we try to encourage more research about this, because we really need gender disaggregated data on exactly, you know, the different impacts of conduct of hostilities on all these, on everybody. And we need some more, we need more research on this. This would be very important. But we also need to address the gender bias that this commander might have. So in that moment when he's deciding about any of these principles that he's supposed to take into consideration, I mean, he would need to be trained actually in being able to apply some kind of gender analysis to the decisions that he's making. And I would say that in that, yes, some militaries are already quite advanced. Like if you look at some of the Nordic countries, you already have this type of training for the military, but it is just the beginning, really. And you have some military manual mentioning this stuff, but we are really at the beginning of this, so it would require a lot more, you know, training and a lot more investment by both states, and not to speak of the armed groups as well, on this, for this really to be able to be reality.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to us today. I think this is a really interesting discussion about the gender perspective on an armed conflict, and we're going to have a bunch of articles coming out about this. So we're focusing on children's role in armed conflict and women in armed conflict, their participation, and also the notion of them being civilians and the gender stereotypes present in the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. So thank you again. And
thank you so much.
Enjoy the discussion, and please tune in for future episodes. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for that.